So in a way, it was actually better to see this, how it reinforces what Ethan Gutman shared with us. Another person who was on that video is actually with us here tonight, Dr. Damon Noto, spokesperson for the Doctors Against Forced Organ Harvesting, which is a non-profit organization founded by medical doctors, does research and monitors the unethical organ procurement situation globally, and carefully focuses on the transplant situation in China. DAFO works with doctors around the world to inform the medical communities and society. Noto testified before the U.S. Congress on unethical organ harvesting practices in China, and like Ethan, will be in Parliament tomorrow. A great pleasure to present to you Dr. Damon Noto.
So, as you can see from the video, I'm gonna run through what the medical community has learned over the past decade and give you, from a medical doctor's perspective, our look at what has happened in China and their transplant community and transplant medicine. So, as he mentioned, I'm with a group of doctors called Doctors Against Forced Organ Harvesting. We have doctors around the world who basically focus on ethical and unethical practices of transplantation, whether they occur anywhere, but our main focus has been on China. To start from the beginning, if we look at transplantation's history, transplants have been going on since the late 1800s. They tried to do tissue transplants, taking ground up organs and trying to transplant into humans. But the actual first successful human-to-human transplant didn't occur in 1954 at Brigham and Women's by a guy named Joseph Murray. And although they tried many, many times in the 30s, 40s to do organ transplant from one person to another, it wasn't until this time in 1954 that they were really successful. Does anybody know why? Anybody know what happened that one succeeded? They had tried with many people. Well, this one in particular was done on identical twins. So they bypassed the rejection. So they kept failing, didn't realize, and this guy was brilliant. He realized, something was happening with rejection, and at this point they used identical twin. So that happened in 54, but it wasn't until 1968 that the United States actually started having laws and policies enacted so that we could actually develop a public organ donation system, and laws could be put in place so that the public would accept it. You got to remember, back at this time, it was a completely new science. People were a little bit afraid of this type of new development. So there had to be a lot of education taking place for people that want to become organ donors. And now we had the enactment of the organ banks, and things on your license would say, yes, I'd be an organ donor if I got into an accident. It was not that just the United States just embraced that and said, okay, it's here now, everybody, let's be organ donors. It took decades to establish a really effective organ donation system and an organ donation program. And then it wasn't all the way until 1991, even further decades later, that internationally we actually had guidelines and policies to say what is ethical transplantation, what's acceptable practices, and this was internationally accepted, and this was come together by a bunch of different medical doctors from around the world. And I'll just go through a few of them. One of them, it has to be free consent. You have to voluntarily give it. It can't be through money, it's altruistic. And these organs need to be traceable. We need to know who's giving them, who's receiving them, and it needs to be transparent and open to scrutiny, which means you got to let the public be able to go in there and look to say, is this happening ethically? And a lot of people had the fear when this happened that the rich were going to benefit off of this a lot, and that their names would always be at the head of the list, or that they would be paying people so that they could get organs. So there was a lot of public distrust, and to get around that, what they said was, in this policy, that basically you need to be able to go in there and look at it. Who's doing them, what's happening, and is it ethical, and is it fair? So China was in a unique situation. What we learned now was China actually enacted a law in 1984 saying that they could use executed prisoners for organs. It wasn't known at the time, but looking back, they started this law. And they didn't really do that many transplantations. In fact, if we look from 1977 to 1999, if we looked at liver transplants, they were doing about 10 a year, 228 total. They really weren't doing a lot. Until after around late 1999 to 2000s, all of a sudden everything changed. And their transplant amounts that they were doing just exploded. So the question everybody asked was, what was happening? From a medical doctor's perspective, they couldn't understand why all of a sudden China was able to do so many transplantations. Something just didn't sit right. They started opening up organ transplant hospitals across the country. As that doctor said in the video, the amount of hospitals that were doing organ transplantation from 2000 to 2004 exploded. And then they started showing up all over the internet. They had these hospital websites which said, come to China, you know, pay a certain amount of money, we'll get you organs. And that was all over the internet. So they had this medical tourism started happening after 2000. And now China, if we look at them, they perform the second most amount of transplants in the world, and maybe even number one, possibly this year. And if you look at their statistics, if you look at Chinese hospital statistics, if you look at it graphically, the amount of transplants each hospital was doing was exponential. And the amount of centers that I opened up just said also increased exponentially. They went from 150 hospitals to over 600. And this slide basically shows, in China's own word, the explosion of how many transplants were taken. This is from China's Minister of Health, the Chinese government statistics. If we look at their statistics from 99 all the way to 2004, you can see that in 2004 they're doing over 10,000 transplants a year. But I want to say an important fact here is that these are China's numbers. If anybody knows anything about China, it's very difficult to trust the numbers, even from their own government, that they're actually truthful. But at least it gives us a standing point and something to work with. And furthermore, this was actually published in the Lancet journal. If you're in the medical community, this is a very well-respected international journal. And the scary thing about this is the Lancet published this without really verifying these numbers. They just accepted it and put it out there as if it's fact. This is just an example of a website that was up saying, come to China, we have organs. If you look, I love this little quote here on the left, fast transplant surgery at a world-class facility. Doctors looking at what's fast transplant mean? Well, if you look at another website, and this I took off the internet just several months ago, still up at that time, I believe it's taken down now, but if you look at their quote, it says, we arrange your trip at a lower cost with no wait in China. So at some point in time, or in the 2000s, it seemed like they had an unlimited supply of organs, like they were just giving them away. And they would invite these doctors over internationally from all different places, say, come to China, let us demonstrate and show you what we're doing. Very complex transplantations, hearts, livers, kidneys. And this guy, Franz Einberg, was the chair of the Swiss National Foundation for Organ Transplant. He actually went, and I love this quote. He says, during my visit, a hospital invited me to watch a heart transplant. The organizer asked us whether we'd like to have the transplant operation in the morning or the afternoon. And he realized at that point, wait a second, someone's getting killed so that I can come watch this surgery. You have to understand from a transplant doctor's perspective, this has never been heard of before. You realize that in the transplant world, anywhere else in the world, people wait on long waiting lists. They're waiting for organs, and when it happens, they go immediately. We don't schedule these things. They're not something that you can say, come in the afternoon, come in the evening time. And these often were scheduled months in advance. And again, it seemed like they had an overwhelming abundance of organs. One hospital was giving, they put on the newspaper, they're giving 23 organs away. The other thing that was scary, like I said, was these short waiting times. So this is something we never saw before. There are hospitals on the internet were saying our average waiting time 1 week for liver. Tianjin, #1 hospital in China, liver transplant 2 weeks. And over here they had a website saying we have a perfectly matching. The waiting time is as short as 1 week. This is something we never saw before. And getting a heart transplant within 24 hours, unheard of. We're talking years in most countries to get a heart transplant. And just so you know, like the video said, organs, you can't take an organ out of a body and just leave it there and stockpile them and say, okay, you know what, we'll take all these organs, we'll put them in the freezer, and when someone comes, we'll do the surgery. It doesn't work that way. Once you take an organ out of a person, you have a very short window to use that organ. Heart, a matter of hours. Kidney, you might have a day or two. But you can't leave these alone. They got to be taken out quickly as possible, get into that person so that you can have a successful transplant. Again, scheduled transplantations. They're on the website. And this was in weeks in advance. Patients would call up and say, you know what, I'm coming in February, can you set me up for a kidney transplant? And they would schedule these. And all this without an effective public organ donation system. So what I mean by that is, when you have, in a society, you basically say, you know what, I'm going to be an organ donor. You put it on your card. Unfortunately, accidents happen, and you happen to be someone that can donate an organ. You have a system in place, and that system is it took a long time to take place and become effective. For instance, if you had a car accident in Florida, and that person, passed away, but they had still viable kidneys, you could take that person's kidneys, and if someone needed it in New York, you could get it all the way to New York in a very short window and transplant that. So that's something that China has never been able to develop. And actually, the Red Cross went into China in 2009. They tried to set up this type of system, but a quote from the Beijing Daily said, not one person had been selected in Beijing over many years. And to date, only about 207 donors at the time that I had written this had become official donors. And the reason is that Chinese people culturally have a reservation about giving away their organs. They really believe that they should be buried with their organs. So an effective organ donation system actually never has been set up, even to this day in China. To give some